So obviously I've heard of the site. I know where Harold Bloom is attacked on the site. I know where the chief rabbi of Israel, right, is attacked on the site. I know where Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, one of the most important religious Zionist leaders, is attacked on the site. And in those 4 cases, I happen to know a little bit about the story, right? In each one of those cases, there's blatant falsification. In my particular case, I obviously know it well. There's blatant falsification beyond any and all belief. I mean, it's to quote a good friend of yours, a well-known psychiatrist. It borders on the satanic. I mean, that's what a very close friend of yours and close friend of your friend's friends, kind of defined it as, I think, correctly. Without attributing to any names here. And it really borders. I mean, the level of complete disregard of fact. And the blatant kind of, and I've actually had some direct contact with the representative, the person who runs the site, and it was just kind of completely amazing to me how, under the cover of a good cause, the good cause is, of course, fighting sexual abuse, right? We actually engage in sexual abuse, right? Meaning using sexuality inappropriately as a way to be vicious, right, and hate, disregarding empirical fact, right? Self-appointing oneself without checking facts, and deliberately distorting them in the most vicious way. For example, writing Gafni's attracted to prepubescent boys, right? Right? It's just literally make something up. It's a horrible thing to do. So I don't want to go into this particular, as I said to you before, this particular thing anymore. I responded only because I wanted to honor your question. I don't want to enter this particular topic anymore because, I'm just not interested in giving it energy in the world, in my own world, just in a purely kind of spiritual, energetic way. The same way that I was having a lunch several years ago with Mr. Prager, and he said he actually doesn't respond to these kinds of things in the world. When we were actually discussing this particular website, because you can't respond to it. It's like, are you supposed to respond to your stalker? The answer is no. So I'm not engaging this. I'm not interested in this. It has no interest to me in my life. The only thing it's helped me with, right, is it's actually helped me get 2 book contracts. I actually should send a thank you note, right, because at this point it's so preposterous, it's so absurd that there's actually a growing outrage over it, and the very level of viciousness of it, is just, is revolting a growing amount of people, which says something good for our kind of, to borrow the old, outdated 18th century term, says something good for our moral sense.
But, okay, I want to respond just to what you said. I'm not going to extend this to, make it a... Right. I understand the ground rules, right, but I want to understand just to what you said. If we do go to that website and we do go to its page on you, most of the entries come from publications from the Jewish Week, Ma'ariv, Israeli newspapers, and I think less than 50% come from blogs. Would you call mainstream publications like?
I'd say 2 things. Right. One is, right, the viciousness. Right. I mean, there's 3 things that happen. One is the viciousness on the site doesn't come from those newspapers. Right. In other words, it comes from, right, the way things are framed, right, on the blog. Right. So the reason those things are there, because it just fills up the page. I mean, it also has on it, just for the record, all positive articles about me. Right. The idea was just to kind of put everything up you could put up. Right. But the viciousness comes from, for example, title page, Gafni accused of molesting, a 14-year-old girl. Completely untrue. You think, oh my God, Gafni, yesterday, the day before, 5 years ago, was molesting a 14-year-old girl, and you forget actually that the truth of the story is, Gafni had a relationship, right, with a woman in high school, right, when he was just out of high school, right, and to distort that, right, a relationship which, validated by polygraph, was by both sides mutually loving, right, in a deep and profound sense, and whether that got, interpreted or as things often do, anyone who knows this field later, right, whether or not, right, to then set that up in a way and write it in a way where you read it, you think, Luke Ford yesterday molested a 7-year-old girl. Well, that's actually, and if we don't actually have common cause on that, we have no business talking to each other, right? Now, if that's okay with you, right, then we don't share any common language at all. Right? If that level of viciousness is okay, if it was okay, right, about your son or your daughter or about your good friend, that's just not okay. That's not okay in any sense, shape, or form. Just It's not okay.
Right.
Now you have a second question. Hold on. And the question is, okay, now here's the second question. And then again, Dennis has written about this extensively. Can mainstream media articles, right, distort? Of course they can. Of course they can. So, for example, the Ma'ariv article that you quote extensively cites from the Awareness Center, right? in other words, the only bad part of the Ma'ariv article comes from the Awareness Center because the reporter, Sari Makover, right, was coming back from vacation, barely had time to write the article, did a quick Google search. Right? She spoke to me afterwards. She came to my apartment crying, apologizing when she realized what she had written. That's precisely the point, right? I mean, and as I actually have a record of the interview she did with me after the article came out, when she realized who she was quoting, she had no idea. She had no idea who she was quoting, right? And it's because the reporter's on a deadline, young reporter, no experience, doesn't really know, what sources of information are, right? And reporters make mistakes like this all the time. She told me she had two articles in. She was away for the weekend, right? And in the last 3 hours before, she quickly went online and just wrote down a bunch of stuff from the Awareness Center. So the only article there that has that kind of material, right, and of that nature is actually the Ma'ariv article, which is from the Awareness Center. Right? I mean, so that's important to understand. And you know what? I want to actually say something here, right? Kind of clearly, and I'm realizing this as we go. So, well, actually, we can talk about it afterwards.
Okay. Did you have a third point, or was it just those two?
No, that's good. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Let me think about what you just said. You've been profiled a lot. How, when you're dealing with someone for a mainstream publication, whether it's the Jewish Week, an Israeli newspaper, or whoever, regular journalism, mainstream journalism, would you call the results of any of that you have personally experienced like hate journalism?
There's a phrase that Prager and Tolushkin use called attack journalism, which Tolushkin uses extensively in his book Words That Hurt, Words That Heal. So I think there's been a certain amount of attack journalism, and more importantly, there's been a certain amount of simply not verifying the facts. In other words, there's been a certain amount of kind of, agendaed, not verifying the facts journalism. That's for sure. I think there's an enormous distinction, however, between the nature of that and the nature of what goes on hate sites. And the wisdom is always, of course, in drawing distinctions. I think that any public figure, from Bill Clinton, who's talked extensively about attack journalism, to Jack Kemp, who talked about attack journalism, to Barack Obama, right, who has a Stop the Smear campaign, So I think any public figure that's been extensively profiled, probably has experienced, some very, very deep and profound level of distortion. A lot of it has to do with, the way journalism happens. Often you have a young reporter on a deadline, doesn't really know the subject, hasn't really had time to look into it, has got like a quick, 2 hours. That happens very, very, very often. Or you have a journalist with a particular agenda, with a particular set of relationships. Particularly that happens in an insular community, where people kind of know each other, are close to each other, old relationships, et cetera, as we discussed, I believe, in our original interview on July 3rd.
Right. So, I mean, the hate sites are basically one-person operations, right? Where there isn't an editor and there isn't an organization behind them.
That's right. The hate sites are almost exclusively one-person operations with no oversight, right? And where the person, often is, profoundly, imbalanced or unethical. So there's not the internal systems that should do editing. We should have internal editors, right? Part of a healthy personality is to have internal editors. But when we don't have internal editors, we basically kind of, we sit in our kitchen alone, and just something comes up, we just kind of put it out there, and we're coming from a particularly imbalanced place, or from a particularly hateful place, or, and it's the people that burned witches, in Europe, It's unclear whether there were 100,000 witches burned or 3 million witches burned. There's a whole, I don't know if you're familiar with the scholarship, there's a range of opinions, but, many, many, many women were killed, by people who